The studio lights are bright, the audience is laughing, and everything feels routine until it suddenly isn't. A single question lands differently than expected, and within seconds, the mood shifts. What was supposed to be another daytime talk show segment becomes something far more uncomfortable. A celebrity known for bold reinvention is no longer playing along. Instead, she's pushing back calmly, directly, and in front of millions watching live. Before we get into what really happened in that moment, subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below because stories like this reveal what really goes on behind the polished surface of live television. This was not just another interview. It was a moment where two very different perspectives collided on air, one representing traditional media commentary, the other representing a new generation of celebrity autonomy. And at the center of it all was a conversation about image, identity, and who gets to define it. Miley Cyrus had already lived multiple public lives by the time she appeared on daytime television that day. From her early years as a Disney Channel star to her dramatic transition into a more provocative, independent artist, every phase of her career had been scrutinized. She had become one of the most talked about figures in pop culture, not just for her music, but for her image, her choices, and her refusal to conform. On the other side of the table sat Joy Behar, a veteran television host known for her sharp commentary and unfiltered opinions. As a co-host on a widely watched daytime talk show, she had built a reputation for speaking her mind, often addressing controversial topics head-on. Her style resonated with audiences who appreciated directness, but it also meant that conversations could sometimes take an unexpected turn. The show itself was designed to blend humor, current events, and celebrity interviews into a seamless broadcast. Most segments followed a familiar rhythm, light conversation, a few jokes, and promotional talking points. Guests came prepared, hosts kept things moving, and the audience remained entertained. But live television has one defining characteristic: there are no second takes. What made this particular appearance different wasn't immediately obvious. At first, everything seemed to follow the usual script. The introduction was warm, the applause was enthusiastic, and the early moments of conversation felt relaxed. Miley smiled, responded with ease, and engaged with the hosts in a way that suggested she was fully in control of the room. But beneath that surface, there was context that couldn't be ignored. In the months leading up to this interview, Miley's public image had been a frequent topic of debate. Her performances, her fashion choices, and her outspoken personality had sparked discussions across media platforms. Some praised her for embracing individuality and challenging expectations. Others criticized her for what they saw as a departure from her earlier, more family-friendly persona. Joy Behar had been among those who voiced opinions about this transformation. On previous episodes of the show, comments had been made about Miley's image, comments that reflected a broader conversation happening in media circles at the time. While not unusual for a talk show format, those remarks carried weight, especially when directed at someone navigating such a visible career evolution. So when Miley walked onto that stage, she wasn't just there to promote a project. She was stepping into a space where her identity had already been discussed, analyzed, and, in some cases, judged. And yet, she didn't show it. At least, not at first. The conversation began with familiar topics: music, creative direction, and the challenges of growing up in the spotlight. Miley spoke confidently about her work, emphasizing artistic freedom and the importance of self-expression. Her tone was measured, her responses thoughtful. She wasn't defensive, but she was clearly aware of how she was being perceived. Joy listened, occasionally interjecting with comments that balanced curiosity and critique. It was the kind of exchange viewers had come to expect, engaging, slightly edgy, but still within the boundaries of daytime television decorum. But live broadcasts have a way of shifting without warning. Sometimes it's a single sentence. Sometimes it's the tone behind a question. And sometimes it's the timing. As the segment progressed, the conversation began to move closer to the subject that had been quietly hovering in the background: Miley's image and how it had been portrayed in the media. The transition was subtle, almost seamless, but it carried an undercurrent of tension. This was the moment where things could go in two very different directions. It could remain a standard discussion, carefully worded, politely navigated, and ultimately forgettable. Or it could become something else entirely. The audience, both in the studio and at home, didn't know it yet. But they were about to witness a shift that would redefine the tone of the interview. Because what happens when a celebrity chooses not to deflect, not to laugh off criticism, but to address it directly on live television, with no edits, no filters, and no room for retreat. That's exactly where this story begins to turn. And what followed wasn't loud or chaotic. It was something far more compelling, measured, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. As the next question approached, the energy in the room changed ever so slightly. It was the kind of shift you might miss if you weren't paying attention. But once it happened, there was no going back. And the real story of that moment was just about to unfold. Long before that moment unfolded on live television, the tension had already been building in quieter, less visible ways. It existed in commentary segments, in panel discussions, in headlines that framed a narrative before the subject ever had the chance to respond directly. For Miley Cyrus, that narrative had followed her through every phase of her career, evolving alongside her but rarely aligning with how she defined herself. Her transition from a controlled, family-friendly image into a more independent and experimental artist had become one of the most discussed shifts in modern pop culture. It wasn't just about music. It was about identity, ownership, and the public's expectation of consistency from someone who had grown up in front of them. Every performance, every appearance, every visual choice became part of a larger conversation, one that often said more about cultural standards than about the artist herself. From a production standpoint, this wasn't unusual. Talk shows thrive on topical discussions, and high-profile figures often become focal points. But for the individual at the center of those conversations, the experience is different. It's not just content, it's personal. By the time Miley agreed to appear on the show, she was already aware of how she had been portrayed in that space. That awareness didn't necessarily mean confrontation was inevitable. Celebrities often navigate similar situations with diplomacy, choosing to focus on their work rather than revisiting past commentary. But it did create a layer of context that couldn't be ignored. At the same time, Miley had been increasingly vocal about her perspective. In interviews and public statements, she spoke about the importance of self-definition. She emphasized that her artistic choices were intentional, not reactions to external pressure. She addressed criticism directly, but without adopting a defensive tone. Instead, she reframed the conversation, shifting it away from judgment and toward understanding. This approach reflected a broader change in how she engaged with the media. Earlier in her career, responses to criticism were often filtered through management strategies and carefully constructed messaging. But as she evolved, so did her communication style. She became more direct, more transparent, and more willing to engage with difficult topics on her own terms. That shift mattered, because it meant that if the conversation turned in a certain direction, she was prepared, not with rehearsed answers, but with a clear sense of her position. Inside the studio, however, none of this was explicitly stated. The segment was structured like any other. The hosts were briefed, the topics outlined, the timing carefully managed. From the audience's perspective, it was just another episode, another guest, another conversation. But live television has a way of blurring the line between preparation and spontaneity. Hosts are given flexibility. They can adjust their questions, follow unexpected threads, respond to the energy in the room. That flexibility is part of what makes the format engaging, but it also introduces unpredictability. Joy Behar, with years of experience, understood that balance. Her role wasn't just to ask questions, it was to guide the conversation, to sense when to push forward, when to hold back, and when to allow a moment to develop on its own. That instinct is what defines seasoned hosts, and it's what often leads to moments that stand out long after the broadcast ends. As the interview progressed, that instinct became more visible. The early questions had established a rhythm. Miley was relaxed, the audience responsive, the tone light. But gradually, the focus began to shift. The questions became more layered, touching not just on what Miley was doing, but how she was being perceived. It was a subtle transition. Instead of directly referencing criticism, the conversation approached it from the edges, through discussions of public reaction, artistic intent, and the challenges of maintaining authenticity in a highly scrutinized environment. These weren't confrontational questions, but they opened the door to deeper topics. Miley responded with clarity. She spoke about growth, about the inevitability of change, about the disconnect between public expectation and personal reality. Her answers were measured, but they carried a sense of intention. She wasn't avoiding the subject, she was preparing for it. The audience, whether consciously or not, began to pick up on the shift. The laughter became less frequent, the applause more selective. The energy in the room remained engaged, but it was no longer purely light-hearted. There was a sense that the conversation was moving toward something more significant. Joy continued to guide that movement. Her follow-up questions became slightly more direct. Her tone remained conversational, but there was a noticeable precision in how she framed certain points. She wasn't rushing the moment, she was building toward it. And then, the context that had been hovering in the background began to come into focus. The topic of image, how it's created, how it's judged, how it's controlled, moved from implication to discussion. It wasn't framed as criticism, but it carried the weight of previous commentary. It was no longer abstract. It was present, in the room, between the host and the guest. For Miley, this was the turning point. Up until now, the conversation had allowed for interpretation. She could address broader ideas without engaging directly with specific remarks. But as the focus narrowed, that distance began to disappear. This is where live television becomes unpredictable. Everything was happening in real time. Joy leaned into the moment, maintaining her composure, keeping her tone steady. Her next question wasn't abrupt, but it was unmistakably more direct than anything that had come before. It referenced perception. It hinted at criticism. It brought the underlying tension into the open without fully defining it. And in doing so, it changed the dynamic of the interview. Miley's reaction wasn't immediate. There was a brief pause, just long enough to register. Her expression remained composed, but her focus sharpened. The ease of earlier moments gave way to something more deliberate. She understood the direction of the conversation, and more importantly, she understood what was being asked. The audience leaned in, sensing the shift. This was no longer just an interview. It was a moment, one shaped by everything that had come before it, every comment, every headline, every discussion that had taken place without her presence. And now, for the first time in this setting, she had the opportunity to respond directly. The question hung in the air, unanswered. And in that brief silence, the tone of the entire broadcast changed. What happened next would not be edited, reframed, or softened. It would unfold exactly as it happened, live, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. The question settles into the space between them, and for a brief second, everything holds still. Miley Cyrus doesn't interrupt. She doesn't deflect. She doesn't immediately respond. Instead, she lets the moment breathe. Her posture remains upright, shoulders relaxed, but her focus narrows. The easy rhythm that defined the earlier part of the interview is gone. In its place is something quieter, more deliberate. Across the table, Joy Behar maintains her composure. Her expression is neutral, attentive. She's asked the question and now waits, giving the space that live television rarely allows but sometimes demands. The other hosts remain still, their attention fixed on Miley, sensing that the conversation has shifted into unfamiliar territory. The audience, too, feels it. There's no laughter now. No applause. Just silence, controlled, but noticeable. It's the kind of silence that doesn't happen by accident. It happens when everyone in the room recognizes that something real is unfolding. Miley inhales slightly, almost imperceptibly. Then she begins. Her voice is calm, measured, not defensive, not confrontational, but intentional. She starts by acknowledging the broader conversation around her image. She doesn't reject it outright. Instead, she reframes it, placing it within the context of growth and personal evolution. Her words are carefully chosen, but they don't feel rehearsed. They feel present. As she speaks, her eye contact doesn't waver. She looks directly at Joy, not in challenge, but in clarity. It's a subtle distinction, but it changes the tone of the exchange. This isn't a performance anymore. It's a response. Joy listens without interruption. For a moment, the usual rhythm of a talk show, question, answer, follow-up, is suspended. The conversation slows, stretching beyond its expected pace. The cameras capture everything. The stillness of the hosts, the attentive posture of the audience, the slight shifts in expression that reveal more than words alone. Miley continues. She addresses the idea of public perception, how it forms, how it spreads, how it often becomes disconnected from intention. She speaks about the pressure to remain consistent with an earlier version of herself and the resistance she feels toward that expectation. Her tone remains steady, but there's a firmness beneath it now. There's no hesitation. At one point, she pauses, not because she's searching for words, but because she's choosing them carefully. The pause isn't long, but it's enough to draw attention. In live television, even a second of silence can feel extended. Here, it feels deliberate. Joy shifts slightly in her seat. It's subtle, but visible. A small adjustment that signals engagement, perhaps even recalibration. She nods once, acknowledging what's being said, but doesn't interject. The moment belongs to Miley now, and she allows it to unfold. The audience remains quiet. Some lean forward slightly. Others sit completely still. Their reactions are no longer vocal. They are visual, expressed through posture and attention. It's a different kind of engagement, one that reflects the seriousness of the exchange. Miley's response moves from general to specific. Without raising her voice or changing her tone, she begins to reference how commentary, especially when repeated, can shape narratives that don't always reflect reality. She doesn't accuse. She doesn't assign intent. But the implication is clear. This isn't just about perception. It's about who controls it. Joy listens, her expression thoughtful. When Miley finishes that part of her response, there's another brief pause. The kind that invites a follow-up, but doesn't demand it. For a moment, it seems like the conversation might shift back, return to safer ground, re-establish the earlier rhythm. But it doesn't. Joy responds. Her tone remains composed, but there's a slight change in cadence. She acknowledges Miley's perspective, then gently reframes the question, bringing it back to the core issue: how public figures navigate criticism and whether certain choices invite that scrutiny. It's not confrontational, but it's direct. Miley listens this time. Her expression remains steady, but there's a noticeable stillness. She doesn't interrupt. She waits until Joy finishes, then takes a moment before responding again. This time, her answer is shorter, more focused. She speaks about ownership, of her image, her decisions, her career. She emphasizes that while public opinion is inevitable, it doesn't define her choices. Her voice remains calm, but the clarity of her message is sharper now. There's no ambiguity. The cameras cut briefly to the other hosts. They remain composed, but their attention is fixed on the exchange. No one moves to redirect the conversation. No one breaks the moment with humor or a change in topic. The usual mechanisms that keep daytime television flowing are paused. Because this isn't a moment that can be redirected. It has to play out. The audience stays quiet. Then, as Miley finishes speaking, there's a slight delay, just a fraction of a second, before a few scattered claps begin. They are not loud, not immediate, but they are there, signaling recognition rather than reaction. Joy nods again. She offers a brief acknowledgement, something that bridges the intensity of the moment without dismissing it. Her tone softens slightly, and for a moment, it seems like the conversation might ease. But the shift has already happened. What began as a standard interview has become something else entirely. Not an argument, not a confrontation in the traditional sense, but a clear, on-air exchange where both sides addressed a topic that had been building long before the cameras started rolling. And it happened without interruption, without editing, without the buffer that usually separates public commentary from personal response. As the segment begins to move forward, the energy in the room is different. Still controlled, still professional, but changed. The laughter doesn't return immediately. The pacing remains slower. Even as the conversation transitions to other topics, there's a lingering awareness of what just occurred. Because moments like this don't disappear when the subject changes. They stay in the room. They stay with the audience. And they stay with everyone watching at home. What was said can't be unsaid. What was revealed can't be hidden. And in the context of live television, that's what gives the moment its weight. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. But it was real. And that made it impossible to ignore. The shift doesn't end when the words do. As Miley Cyrus finishes speaking, the studio holds onto the moment just a little longer than usual. It's not scripted, not planned, just a natural pause that follows something that carried more weight than expected. The kind of pause that tells everyone in the room that what just happened mattered. The applause that follows is restrained. Not the loud, immediate reaction typical of daytime television, but something more measured. A few hands come together first, then others join in. It's less about entertainment and more about acknowledgement. The audience isn't reacting to a punchline. They're responding to clarity. Across the table, Joy Behar maintains her composure. Her expression is steady, professional, but slightly more reflective than before. She nods once more, offering a brief verbal acknowledgement that signals the conversation is moving forward. It's a subtle pivot, one that experienced hosts know how to make. She doesn't dismiss what was said, but she also doesn't linger on it longer than necessary. Because live television demands forward motion. The segment continues. Another host steps in with a lighter question, an intentional shift in tone. The transition isn't abrupt, but it's noticeable. The goal is clear: to bring the energy back to something more familiar, more aligned with the expectations of the format. Miley responds, her tone adjusting accordingly, but there's still a trace of the earlier moment in her delivery. The ease has returned, but not entirely. There's a difference now. It's in the pacing, in the way each response feels slightly more deliberate, in the awareness that something unscripted has already taken place, something that can't be edited or reframed before reaching the audience at home. The cameras continue to move, capturing reactions from different angles. Audience members sit attentively. Some still appear focused on what was just said, their expressions thoughtful rather than reactive. The usual rhythm of laughter and applause gradually returns, but it carries a different texture, less spontaneous, more controlled. The segment eventually reaches its closing moments. Miley is thanked for her time. The hosts offer final remarks, maintaining their professionalism, keeping the tone consistent with the rest of the broadcast. The audience applauds again, this time louder, signaling the end of the interview. From a production standpoint, the segment is complete. But the moment itself doesn't end there. Almost immediately, it begins to extend beyond the studio. Viewers who watch the exchange in real time begin to react. Some focus on the question, others on the response. Clips start to circulate, isolating specific parts of the conversation. The pacing of live television, continuous and fleeting, gives way to something more permanent. A moment that lasted minutes becomes something revisited repeatedly. Media outlets take notice. Coverage doesn't frame the exchange as a dramatic confrontation, but as a notable shift within a routine format. The focus centers on the directness of the response, the fact that it happened live, and the way both participants maintained composure throughout. It's discussed not as conflict, but as clarity. For Miley, the impact is immediate but nuanced. She doesn't leave the stage visibly shaken or altered. Her composure remains intact, her presence consistent. But the perception of the moment changes how that appearance is understood. It's no longer just another promotional interview. It becomes part of her broader narrative. A point where she addressed something directly, in a space where it had previously been discussed without her. For Joy, the moment reflects the nature of her role. As a host, engaging with difficult topics is part of the format. The exchange doesn't disrupt that, it reinforces it. But it also highlights the balance required in live television, asking direct questions while managing the unpredictability of real-time responses. There's no correction, no clarification issued after the broadcast. Because nothing said required it. The exchange stands on its own. And that's what gives it significance. In the days that follow, the moment continues to circulate. Viewers revisit it not for spectacle, but for what it represents. A rare instance where a public figure engages directly with commentary in the same space where it originated. Not through statements or interviews elsewhere, but within the format itself. That distinction matters, because it changes the dynamic. It turns a one-sided conversation into a dialogue. Over time, the moment becomes part of a larger discussion about media, perception, and control. It's referenced when conversations arise about how celebrities navigate criticism, about the role of talk shows in shaping narratives, about the evolving relationship between public figures and the platforms that discuss them. It doesn't dominate headlines, but it remains relevant, because it reflects something broader than the individuals involved. It reflects a shift in how those moments are handled. Less avoidance, more directness, less performance, more presence. And that's why it continues to resonate. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was measured and real. Because it happened in a space designed for conversation, and it stayed within that space without breaking it. For viewers, it serves as a reminder of what live television can be at its most compelling. Not perfectly controlled, not entirely predictable, but capable of capturing something genuine in real time. And for anyone watching, whether in the studio or at home, that's what made it stand out. It wasn't just what was said. It was where, when, and how it was said. And once it happened, it became part of the record, unchanged, unedited, and impossible to ignore. If you want more deep dives into moments like this, where live television reveals what usually stays behind the scenes, subscribe to Prime Talk, like this video, share it with others, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.